Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a magnifying glass to a really densely packed excerpt all about the mechanics of human consciousness. It's a short text, but man, it meticulously maps out how to introduce a completely new, complex model of the mind. So, let's jump right into it.
Here's the core question we've got to grapple with right out of the gate. How do we even begin to understand the underlying mechanics of something as profound as the gateway experience? The author of our source text faces a massive pedagogical challenge here. Think about it. How do you bridge the gap between everyday, known states of mind and an entirely new, complex model of consciousness? Like, how do you map the unknown for a reader who's literally never been there?
Okay, let's dive into Section 1, the biomedical foundation, which is all about grounding the theory. The author doesn't just throw us into the deep end with abstract ideas. Instead, they start by laying down a very specific foundation, a grounding wire, if you will, before they ever properly introduce the main concept of the gateway experience.
The author actually comes right out and says, I began the narrative by briefly profiling the fundamental biomedical factors. Basically, they're telling us exactly how they're going to teach us. They are anchoring this complex phenomenon not in some vague mysticism or philosophy, but in biology and medicine. By stating they'll profile fundamental biomedical factors, they're promising a framework based on physical, observable, and measurable reactions right inside the human body.
To build out that robust biomedical foundation, the text specifically isolates three distinct related techniques: hypnosis, biofeedback, and transcendental meditation. Now notice what these three practices actually have in common. They're established, they're widely studied, and we have actual measurable biomedical data on what happens to the human brain and nervous system during hypnosis, how we can physiologically respond during biofeedback, and we know the physical markers of transcendental meditation.
Moving right along to Section 2, the methodology and baseline comparison. This brings up a pretty fascinating question about the author's whole approach. Why these three specific techniques? See, the author isn't just giving us a random history lesson on alternative mental states. There's a deeply calculated reason for introducing these highly familiar techniques right at the starting line of the paper.
And the source text tells us exactly why. It's entirely about establishing a baseline for comparison. Specifically, the author wants us to focus really closely on the objectives and the mode of functioning of these three techniques. Think of it like learning to fly a jet by first comparing it to how a glider, a helicopter, and a prop plane function. You've got to look at what they are ultimately trying to achieve, their objectives, and how their internal engines actually work, their mode of functioning.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the precise cognitive strategy being mapped out. On one side, we have our knowns, the objectives and mechanics of hypnosis, biofeedback, and meditation. On the other side, we have the gateway experience. The author explicitly writes that these familiar techniques are profiled so that they can be compared in the reader's mind with the gateway experience, as the model of its underlying mechanics is developed. So you're literally meant to hold the mechanics of hypnosis in one hand and the emerging mechanics of gateway in the other, and actively compare the two as the text progresses.
That takes us into Section 3, supporting conclusions and building the argument. The brilliance of this methodology doesn't stop at just giving the reader a handy mental comparison tool. This introductory material serves a vital secondary structural purpose for the entire document. The author explicitly notes, additionally, that introductory material is useful in supporting the conclusions of the paper. So, the biomedical factors of hypnosis, biofeedback, and meditation aren't just clever analogies, right? They are actual load-bearing pillars for the author's thesis. The scientific evidence gathered from how these known techniques affect the human body is actively recycled at the very end of the text to validate the final findings about the gateway experience. It's just a perfectly closed loop of logic.
Finally, let's look at Section 4, entry points and active tools. This brings us to the most dynamic, functional application of these related techniques. The author takes them from being mere points of comparison or supporting structural evidence and transforms them into active, practical tools.
So the crucial point here is that the author completely redefines these practices as useful entry points. They are not the final destination. In this context, you don't utilize biofeedback just to achieve biofeedback. You use it as a runway. They're practical starting lines designed specifically to launch the subject forward into the primary experience that's actually being studied.
And this brilliantly illustrates the functional, mechanical progression the author outlines. It is a clear sequential three-step process. Step 1, you profile the related techniques so the mind truly understands their biomedical factors. Step 2, you actively use them as entry points. And step 3, you leverage them to actually accelerate movement into the gateway experience itself.
I want to hover on that phrase for a second, though. Accelerate movement. The terminology here is entirely based on momentum and physics. The author views these biomedical factors, the trance state of hypnosis, the physiological control of biofeedback, the deep focus of meditation, as literal catalysts. They act almost like a gravitational slingshot, using the momentum of known states of consciousness to propel the subject at an accelerated rate right into the unfamiliar territory of the gateway experience. How wild is that?
This entire excerpt is just an absolute masterclass in how to structurally introduce the unknown using the known, but it leaves us with an incredibly compelling cliffhanger based purely on the author's own framework. If transcendental meditation, hypnosis, and biofeedback, literally some of the most profound states of human consciousness we can biomedically measure, are merely the entry points, what on earth lies at the end of the gateway experience? Think about that for a minute. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the mechanics of everything you know.